Good morning, everybody. My name is Peju, and I work here at BenevolentAI as the Director of Clinical Program Management. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. Data diversity is an important topic here for us at BenevolentAI, being an AI organization and data being at the core of what we do. We recognize the importance of having access to a wide-ranging, broad spectrum of data that is diverse enough so that innovations that we come up with can be applied to a broad section of the population. It's important to generate and utilize diverse data in the work we do. And with that, we've pulled together a diverse pool of panelists who represent various aspects of the industry, from tech to biomedical science, to really talk about what data diversity means to them, how they are tackling the challenge, and what solutions they are working on to make the issue less of an issue moving forward. So welcome, everybody.
I think we have a wealth of data, but we've got to be very careful about the quality of the data. For us here, data is really our currency. It's what we feed on and what we need. But we have to be sure that the data sources we're working with are of the right quality, represent the patient population accurately, and also that we're very transparent about how we're going to use the data and what we're going to use the data for. So correspondingly, if you look more broadly, a lot of health data is seen as a commodity, but actually I think that sometimes we overvalue the data. And one of the things that I think we've got a real opportunity in the UK, and it's something that I have talked government about, is that we have a very diverse population, but I don't think we're actually tapping into that as much as we could be, especially for clinical trials. Others might disagree, but from my perspective, one of the things that we can learn from the US is that one of the reasons for this is that although the NHS has a lot of diversity in terms of its clinical population, many of those clinicians are not involved in clinical trials, and I think there's something that individual companies who are using data can be more proactive about going out and finding data sources that are truly representative of the patient population, rather than a very small percentage of the patient population.
Okay. Yes, indeed. And, data is being used in all aspects of our day-to-day life. Obviously, our focus here today is on research and biomedical science. But I just wonder, Diane, if you can elaborate on how you guys are utilizing electronic health medical records, data available within the Scottish landscape.
So we're very fortunate in Scotland in that we've used electronic health records for much longer than most of the UK. So that means we do have access to longitudinal patient data. As Jackie said, quality of that data is always an issue, but we do within Scotland have the healthcare boards using similar systems for tracking patients. So in principle, pulling that data together should be easier, though obviously in practice it always takes much more time and effort than you imagine. I think the biggest challenge for us is Scotland is only 5 million people. When you think about the size of London, we're very small. We have a homogeneous population. We're predominantly Scottish. We like being in Scotland. We stay there, except for when we go to Australia and New Zealand and Canada, parts of the US. So we have exported our genome to other parts of the world, but predominantly we're Scottish people in Scotland. So for us, that's good because we can pull together really rich, uniform, highly annotated and curated data sets with a bit of effort. But the challenge for us is we are not diverse. So when we go and we speak to industry about what we can offer as an organization, we can offer that rich data sets, but diversity for us is a challenge. So what we would be doing is federating analysis with different organizations like Target Pharma Solutions in the US. And obviously in the UK, we're really fortunate that we have things like the UK Biobank, whereby we can bring in data from UK Biobank 100,000 genome projects and merge that with our own rich Scottish data to increase the diversity of the data that we have access to.
Thank you. And I think you highlight an important point there, in that there are various groups, various health authorities, private organizations generating data sets. And it strikes me like, a lot of that activity is somewhat siloed within their areas. So I'd like to get Dawn to come in and talk to us about, access to data and facilitating that, because innovation, especially using AI, requires a rich pool of data. And if people are working on their siloed data set, that comes with its challenges. So your insight into what's been done to try and open that up.
Yeah. I think I'm going to start by saying it's very hard. Data sharing generally is a nightmare, just to be completely honest. Like, I used to work in government, and at the centre of government, working with departments you're trying to get them to share vaguely sort of very innocuous data for obvious sort of efficiency outcomes, I think personal sensitive, and it just takes a very long time. But I think innovation that happens externally with startups and other organisations can then promote the bigger organisations to slowly create change. I also want to talk a bit about your point around clinical trials and how we need to diversify the groups of people that are involved in that. I also think it's about trust, because people from diverse backgrounds may not trust these institutions. So it's about being transparent, as you said, around sometimes the lack of diversity within data sets, but also building trust externally with the diverse groups that we want to get data from. So it's a few issues there.
Yes, definitely. And, generating diverse data set is important in medical research, especially because with the medicines that we create and get approved, the impact has to be far-reaching. And at the moment, we find that research is done on a small subset of the population. And then once the drug is approved, we then have post-marketing authorization, starting to gather data on how effective the drug is in women, in older population, and different people of different ethnicity. And it sounds to me that we are putting the research question after when we should really be generating the information. So Rob, perhaps this is the best time to draw you into the conversation, because you've got extensive experience in the pharma industry. And my question to you is, why is it so challenging to generate that diverse data within clinical trials?
I mean, it's around a lot of the companies are involved in a simple question. You put a project in and you're trying to achieve an objective. So if you don't achieve that objective, then it's considered failed. So this is the thing, is that you've still collected data. So within the pharmaceutical industry, you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, and you're trying to achieve that goal. So is this medicine safe and effective? So you're not asking the question, is this medicine safe and effective in every single diverse population? And because of that, sometimes the data gets lost on the way, because everybody is you might see a male and a female difference during early development, and that automatically was not the question, because the question was, is this safe and effective? But nobody asked the question, is this safe and effective in males versus females? So what happens during research is that you will get a result and you may get a sex difference. So what generally tends to happen is that you will try and do the next study and you try and collapse that down. So say it was 5 and 10 mg per kg. You may do 7.5 in the middle, and you may lose that sex difference. And because nobody wants, the question wasn't, how do we increase the size of our trials? So the data that's available and is coming back in, it's about understanding what it is, but using that data more instead of only using the data that's going forward. So it's about can we use this data more? And it's about integrating the data. You know, we get asked a lot by regulators, so I see lots of regulatory packages. So my company deals with packages to governments, and we get feedback from the governments, and basically they say, you know, please integrate your data. And the number of times that you see this, and this is their way of saying, look, we can see that you've got the data and you've got the result that you were looking for, but you've also got variability in the data. What does the variability mean? Discuss the variability. And there's no guidance that says you have to do X, Y, and Z, but they will generally say, have an overview of your data, try and understand what is the source of variability. But because that takes time and money, is that sometimes the culture of only looking for the result at the end and not looking for the data around it. And so that's what it is to me, is around, you know, something that I do is integrate data, and I look at the wealth of data, not just what was the question that I was asked and what's the result of that, more to do with what are all the factors around this data in terms of thinking about populations and diverse populations, because we get asked those questions later on in development. When you go for registration, they will ask you, have you considered, you know, males versus females? Show us the data. But if the data hasn't been analysed in that way, you know, then that's not going to come out in a label, for example.
Yeah, I think for me, what you say is really important. You know, I think the way that clinical trials are performed, the way that we test to see whether drugs work, there's some inherent flaws in that. It's possible that some of the late-stage clinical failures that we've seen in certain drugs are because you aren't targeting the right patient population, that you're looking for a kind of all-comers Alzheimer's dementia population, and actually there probably are different subtypes, and by not stratifying your patient population properly, there's a good chance that you might have a candidate in a smaller subset of patients, but not in a much larger, broader.
You've got two different things. You've got the drive to reduce variability, so that you can see a signal in a smaller population, but you've also got this converse drive from the commercial side to maximise the population that you're going to expose your drug to. And it's finding that balance. And I think, you know, make a good point, Rob, about it's the question you're asking. Now, there was an incentive for companies to do, well, really a directive, to make sure that their drugs could be available to children. And that was, so paediatric plans now are an integral part of drug discovery. And maybe one of the things to think about is how can one incorporate a similar kind of requirement for exploration in more diverse populations without necessarily forcing it too early. But I think you're right. I do think the failure is quite possibly because when you're doing your phase 2 studies, you're constraining a lot. We're still seeing 50% failure in phase 3. When you go out to a slightly broader population, that variability becomes important.
I think across the board, data diversity is just such a complex topic that for me it's about thinking about how many layers you have to peel back. So two things that you just mentioned there I think are core, culture and business. So one is a lot of the assumptions, and the more layers you peel back, the more you see its underlying fundamental cultural norms, and it's not necessarily bad intentions, but it's cultural blindness, and we have to address that somehow. So part of it is actually peeling all the way back and saying how do decisions get made, how do you decide whatever the product is, who the product is for, who your audience is, how they're going to be using it, why you assume that this part of the population might be using it and another part might not. Also business, so thinking about it in a different way and actually making business sense of it and starting to focus on business cases and saying, okay, actually if we expose it to a wider audience, it makes perfect business sense. Maybe not to everyone, maybe that's too wide because as you said, there needs to be a balance, but slightly wider. But again, that goes back to business culture and culture. One thing that I find useful, so we've talked a lot about data collection, but also in terms of the complexity of the problem, I think it's interesting to look at 3 levels. So one is about data collection. So what kind of data do you collect? How do you collect it? Where do you collect it from? How do you make sure you have privacy and consent issues and all of that? That's one area that we've talked about a lot. Another area is a lot of product development also uses found data sets. But then again, you have to look at what did you find there and how do you assess what you found, and that all of the concerns that you might have about collecting data are also addressed in terms of the found data sets. And then the third level is how do you look at what hasn't been collected? So how do you identify gaps? Because there will be gaps, and the gaps are, our cultural blind spots often. And so I think we're going to talk about a little bit about diversity in terms of workplace diversity. I think that's one partial answer to it. But maybe I like that kind of segmentation of rules, norms, and responsibilities. So you said there need to be some directives, there need to be some outside incentives or directives. Then it's about norms and cultural change and awareness, which is great. This is more and more developing now, the fact that we're talking about diversity. And then it's about personal responsibility and about actually every single time you're working on something like that, asking yourself these questions.
In where I used to work, I always remember it was the head of the whole global clinical safety when I was discussing data and being able to use data. And he just said something to me, and I always remember it. And he said that it's probably the same across all pharmaceutical companies worldwide. And you have when you do a clinical trial, you basically have a patient leaflet that says, we are going to do a trial and we're going to collect your data and we are going to do everything we possibly can with this data to advance human science. And he goes, we don't do it because we only collect the data for the primary endpoint. The data is only in X format and we don't do anything else.
That's one of the reasons I joined Benevolent, because using the technology we can now very easily go back in and look at that data. But the other point I wanted to make is the people, we talk about gaps, if there's not diversity in the people who are looking at the gaps, or not diversity in people who are planning the trials right at the beginning, because if you plan the trial, then you might go out to Rwanda or India or wherever, but if you are not engaging with the people in those countries very early on, which frequently we're not, you leave it to the CRO who has the local representative, but by then the trial is kind of on the way, we're not really embracing it.
Yeah, and I want to make a point that, so I think I care a lot about diversity in tech, and I've been to lots of events like this, and I think the challenges are the same across almost every sector. We could have the same conversation about tech, about this applies to anyone who's working with data, and I think we all need to we need to actually make a change now, because I feel as though we talk about the frameworks, this and that, but I think it's very obvious what the steps that we need to take are. We need to make sure that we've got the diverse people who are working on things. We need to make sure that we're thinking about the questions thoroughly before we take action. And I don't want this to continue to be, diversity on the side. It should be as these organisations are actually building these trials or whatever it is, as they're implementing things, this conversation should be where the action actually is. And I think it slowly is becoming like that, but I still haven't seen enough action yet, and it can be tiring.
Part of it is getting the data as well. Yeah. Because if we can get the data that shows that if you are more inclusive or you do consider these things, actually you are more likely to be successful, you reduce phase 3 failures or have better recruitment or be able to make better decisions, then it's not, we have to make it core, and part of that is it's not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is, but actually incentivizing it and showing that it is actually makes business sense to do it. I mean, there is evidence about diversity on boards and things like that. And that's maybe something we can think about, is how can we get the evidence, or there probably is quite a bit of evidence, but can we marshal it and use it to convince people that this is actually, if you don't do it, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage for whatever reason.
And I also, just another thing, I also think it's important for us to go to the people who are actually who are the implementers and talk to them about this, because I've worked in policy, I'm a product manager, I'm not actually a technical person. I'm not the person that is annotating data, I'm not the person that's designing the trial. So we need to take this debate to the people who are actually doing the implementation and interrogating that. And it's not always super exciting. Like, I've done work to annotate data, or just in the actual design, in the collection. It's not really exciting on a day-to-day basis, but we need to make sure these people know about these conversations and we're influencing the way that they work.
Yes. Please go ahead.
I agree. It needs to be framed, I think, though, pragmatically in a business, with a business lens, right? Because, so working with startups, one thing that we have an acceleration program for AI and machine learning startups called MI Garage. Part of MI Garage is actually an ethics framework that we developed in an ethics committee, and when we onboard companies, we do ethics consultations with them, which include ethical use of data. There are some other things, but it's mainly around ethical use of data, and it includes questions around what kind of data are you using, who is it going to impact. Most companies have some level of awareness and definitely good intention, but maybe similarly to part of what's happening in pharma, you know, there are business objectives, and it's, you know, I want to help my company like survive and grow, and it's similar pressures that are perceived that sometimes keep people from being more inclusive, or from, say, gathering more data sets because they don't have the funds, or they don't want to invest the funds to gather more, or analyze what they have, all of that. So I think unless we also find a way of framing it in a way that just makes perfect business sense to them, combining that kind of, it needs to happen, but also it is not a disbenefit, it's actually a benefit to your company. So almost speaking more in business terms, because sometimes these conversations get wrongly stuck in a kind of diversity corner, as you said.
And I think, you know, is a valid point, and I think across all sectors, definitely this issue has been talked about, and this is why BenevolentAI is actually bringing this type of events, because it shouldn't only be a top-down approach, saying we now have to start, you know, incorporating diversity into our day-to-day. I think it's everybody's responsibility to really think about it in their day-to-day work, and I think if the workforce start asking the right questions, and really putting that into their work, then ultimately that trickles down into your projects, into the strategy, and really moves into leadership, and that further, you know, shows that it is not acceptable to really just, you know, focus on a sector subset of the population and think that, you know, it's okay to apply the data to all. So I think from this conversation so far, I guess, you know, we can spend all day really talking about what the issues are, what could be better, but ultimately I'd like, you know, to really start working towards the session where you guys actually have the breakout group discussion at your tables. But before then, I'm happy to take one or two questions to the panelists, just to see if there are areas you want to dig into at all. Any questions? One over here.
Hiya. So one of the questions I wanted to think about was, so if we're now sort of streamlining clinical trials so that we're getting to more and more personalised medicine, we're doing that kind of based on the data that we've already got as well. And I just wanted to think about sort of how we're creating this sort of personalised medicine approach for, again, a subset of the subset that we're working with already, and kind of how we can sort of readdress that, bearing in mind it's based on, you know, decades of data prior to that point. And it's like how quickly can we feasibly sort of rectify that problems?
I think one of the things, just thinking about what was saying, you could see that, I think is what you're getting to, that you're going to actually become more exclusive by taking that further and further down. And I think maybe the approach and the way I think about it is, if I'm looking at a personalised medicine approach, although it might be a genetic marker for X, maybe you should still ask yourself the question, say, can I have a diverse population with the marker for X? Or in fact, I would phrase it even differently and say, why should I not have a diverse population within this particular personalised medicine approach? So I think that's the way to approach it, is to say, you know, if you're personalising the approach, you're basing it on some parameter, but that doesn't unless it's, for example, that parameter is solely found in Afro-Caribbean or solely found in white Caucasian males over 30, there's no reason why you shouldn't look at the trial and say everything, that marker or whatever being equal, we should still be able to have diversity in that trial. And so I would say that maybe the question we should ask is not can we have diversity, it's to say why shouldn't we have diversity?
Yeah. And Diane, I think you might have an example of that similar approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, a lot of the data that we collect is legacy data. So obviously they've been looking for specific things, asking specific questions of the data. But I think even within those rich data sets and having more access to more rich, highly annotated, curated data sets is really vital. I think the WHO estimates that less than 20% of the world's medical data is available in the form for AI and ML to ingest and learn from. Now, if we could access all that data and we could mine that data more effectively, you would be able to see those subtle patterns within the behavior that could enable you maybe to find better biomarkers, to get better companion diagnostics, and ultimately to stratify patients into the right populations for clinical trials. I mean, I think obviously cancer has been the poster child for precision medicine, given that many mutations drive particular cancers. But actually, I think what we're seeing now is that most diseases have some sort of precision medicine within them, and it's just a matter of how you find those subtle differences within the populations, and obviously that's where AI and machine learning comes in.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually talk about standards, because I think this is what we're talking about. And we had a conversation earlier around even like tagging different diseases. Everyone, if you have a different background and history, you could call something liver disease, something cirrhosis, something, and it would affect the outcome that you have. So I think it's really important that we begin to create common standards for what we're doing, as well as obviously making sure that there's diverse people working on products and outcomes.
Thank you. And thanks to all of our panelists today. I think the conversation has been really good, and thanks for the input. So thank you.